Blizzard has spent 20 years trying to make the perfect boss fight, and they have failed spectacularly more times than you'd think. From bosses that were literally impossible to kill, to encounters that destroyed hundreds of guilds overnight, to fights so overtuned the devs had to panic patch them within days. Today I'm breaking down every single hardest boss in World of Warcraft history and what makes each one legendary, starting with the one that started it all, Sithun on Chiraj. In January 2006, Blizzard released a boss that could not be killed. Not really hard to kill, literally mathematically impossible to defeat. Sithun was the final boss of the Temple of Anchiraj, an old god lurking beneath the desert, and he was completely broken from day one. Here's how the fight worked. Sithun had an I-beam phase where guilds had roughly 10 seconds of vulnerability to deal damage before tentacles erupted and started shredding everyone. The numbers were tuned so aggressively that no combination of 40 players, no matter how perfectly geared, could deal enough damage. The DPS check was beyond what the game's own math allowed, and guilds didn't know this immediately. Top rating guilds were burning through 500 gold per attempt in consumables, wiping over and over, assuming they were making mistakes. They weren't, they were throwing gold into a brick wall that Blizzard accidentally shipped as a boss encounter. It took 11 days before Blizzard emergency nerfed Sithun into a killable state. 11 days of the entire hardcore community slamming against something that was never possible in the first place, right? But here's why Sithun matters for this entire video. It set the template. From this moment forward, Blizzard was locked in a constant tug-of-war with difficulty. Every boss on this list exists somewhere on that spectrum, and the next one, it made Sithun look like a warm-up. 4 horsemen. Sithun was mathematically impossible. Blizzard had to nerf it because nobody on the planet could kill it, but the 4 horsemen, they were beatable from day one, and that made them so much worse. Released in patch 1.11 as part of Naxxramas, the 4 horsemen was Vanilla WoW's final exam. 4 bosses, each sitting at roughly 6 million HP, all active at the same time in a 40-player raid. The fight required a precise 8 tank rotation to handle the stacking marks each horseman applied. Mark of Korthaz, Mark of Rivendare, each one stacking higher and hitting harder the longer you stayed near the same boss. Every tank had to be in exactly the right position at exactly the right time, swapping between horsemen in a choreographed dance that left zero room for improvisation. 8 warriors in a single raid. Guilds were literally poaching tanks from other guilds just to field the roster. Here's the thing, one tank misstepping meant a guaranteed immediate raid wipe, not a recovery situation, not a burn through it moment, a full reset, hours of preparation, consumables, coordination, all erased because one person out of 40 made a single mistake. Guilds reported spending over 100 raid hours before they could kill this fight consistently, not 100 attempts. 100 hours. The pressure on individual players was unlike anything WoW had ever produced. Every single person in that raid had to be performing perfectly at the same time for the entire duration of the encounter, and the community still argues about this fight to this day. Was it a pure gear check dressed up as mechanics, or was the coordination demand genuinely incomparable? Nobody has settled that debate in almost 20 years, but here's what everyone agrees on. Sithun was broken by design. The 4 horsemen were broken by human error, and somehow that was harder to fix. But if you think coordinating 40 people was brutal, wait until you see what Burning Crusade did to 25-man raids with a boss called Muru. Every raid boss before Muru punished the group. You wiped because the raid failed collectively, because healers couldn't keep up, because DPS was too low across the board, because tanks lost aggro. Muru changed the rules. For the first time in WoW history, one single player standing 2 feet to the left could kill 24 other people instantly. Let me explain why that matters. Muru dropped in March 2008 as the penultimate boss of Sunwell Plateau, and and on paper, the numbers alone were brutal. Roughly 9.2 million HP crammed behind a 6-minute and 15-second enrage timer. But the DPS check wasn't what broke guilds. The positioning was. The fight demanded that every single person in your 25-player raid stand in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time. One player drifting into the wrong position triggered a cascade failure that wiped the entire group. Not made things harder, wiped. Done. Start over. And in a 25-person raid, the odds of someone making a mistake on any given pull were enormous. Top guilds poured over 200 hours into Muru progression. Not because the boss was mathematically impossible like Sithun was at launch, the math worked. The problem was human error. Muru introduced a personal responsibility floor higher than anything WoW had ever demanded. You weren't just responsible for doing your job. You were responsible for not ending everyone else's night. That's a specific kind of frustrating that still makes veteran players twitch when you bring it up. Here's the thing though, Muru wasn't even the final boss of Sunwell. That honor belongs to the demon waiting behind him, and the debate over which one was actually harder has been raging for over 15 years. Kill Jaden, Sunwell Plateau. This is the fight that invented the phrase guild breaker. Not borrowed it, not adopted it, invented it. And once you understand why, you'll understand why nearly half of all progression guilds in Burning Crusade never finished their own expansion. Kill Jaden was the final boss of Sunwell Plateau, released in patch 2.4, and he was designed to be the ultimate exam for everything TBC had taught you. 9.6 million HP, a 7-minute enrage timer, and a phase 2 orb management mechanic that was, without exaggeration, the single most unforgiving mechanic in the game at that point. You either controlled the orbs perfectly or your entire raid died instantly. There was no recovering. There was no, we'll push through it. One mistake, and you were running back from the graveyard. Guilds reported 100 to 150 attempts or more just to get their first kill. And here's the thing, roughly 40% of guilds that attempted him never killed him at all before TBC ended. That's not a typo. Nearly half of all progression guilds spent an entire expansion locked out of the final victory screen. They raided for months, geared up, pushed through every boss before him, and then hit a wall they simply could not break through. That created a hard divide in the community. You either killed Kill Jaden or you didn't. There was no in between. Guilds that couldn't beat him disbanded, merged, or just stopped raiding entirely. The phrase guild breaker was born right here, in this room, on this boss. But before we get to his second appearance, we need to talk about an old god that drove players literally insane. Yogg-Saron, Ulduar, everything we've talked about so far was hard. Genuinely hard, but Yogg-Saron hard mode wasn't hard. It was borderline impossible. Let me explain. Ulduar launched in April 2009, and Blizzard tried something new. Instead of just having a normal and heroic version of the final boss, they built a modifier system. 4 keepers of Ulduar could assist your raid during the fight, each one providing a powerful buff. You could bring all 4 for the easiest version, or you could remove them one by one, making the fight progressively more brutal. 0 keepers, 0 assistants, 0 light in the darkness. That was the real fight. Yogg-Saron had 3 distinct phases, each one demanding completely different positioning, awareness, and coordination. Phase 1 had you dealing with Sarah and her guardians. Phase 2 sent players into the brain room while others fought tentacles outside. Phase 3 was Yogg-Saron himself, fully unleashed. The sanity mechanic ran across all of them, and the encounter required you to mentally track over 12 simultaneous mechanics at any given moment. Sanity management, portal rotations, ad control, brain room coordination, tentacle spawns, gaze mechanics. The cognitive load was unlike anything the game had ever produced. But here's the detail that tells you everything. The Zero Light version of Yogg-Saron took nearly 3 months after Ulduar's launch before anyone on the planet cleared it. Stars claimed the world first in July 2009. 3 months, guilds tracked 200 to 300 plus attempts, an estimated 350 plus raid hours of progression, and almost every single one of them failed. Fewer guilds cleared this encounter globally than many PvE achievements require. That's not hyperbole. That's documented history. And this fight sparked something bigger. It was the moment the community started fracturing over difficulty philosophy. Should hard modes exist at this level? Should content be designed that virtually nobody on Earth can complete it for months? That debate never really ended. It just evolved into the mythic versus heroic arguments we still have today. But regardless of where you stand on that debate, one thing is unanimous. Yogg-Saron Zero Light earned its place as one of the most mechanically complex encounters in WoW history. And if you think that's the peak of Wrath of the Lich King difficulty, you haven't met the final boss of the expansion yet, the Lich King. Here's the thing about the Lich King. He might not be the hardest boss on this list, but he's the one everybody remembers. So he released in December 2009 with patch 3.3, the Lich King was the final boss of Wrath of the Lich King, the culmination of an entire expansion's worth of buildup. On 10-player normal, he sat at roughly 8.5 million HP. Heroic scaled that to approximately 3 times as much, and guilds spent anywhere from 50 to 150 attempts beating him on Heroic, which sounds brutal until you compare it to what we just talked about with Yogg-Saron. The Heroic Lich King had a reported 40% kill rate among guilds that actually attempted him. That's significantly more accessible than Yogg-Saron hard mode. It's not a brick wall, it's a genuine challenge, but one that most dedicated guilds could eventually overcome. So why does everyone treat this fight like it was the hardest thing ever made? Because difficulty isn't just mechanics, it's context. The Lich King wasn't just a raid boss, he was the villain, the face on the box, the guy in every cinematic, every quest line, every Death Knight's origin story. When your guild finally killed him, it wasn't just a loot drop, it was an event. Players remember exactly where they were, who they were with, what they said on voice chat. That doesn't happen with a boss that's just mechanically punishing, and this is where the community splits hard. Some players insist Heroic Lich King was famous hard, not actually hard, that Yogg-Saron and earlier content demanded far more mechanical precision. Others argue the emotional stakes made every attempt feel heavier, every wipe feel worse, and every kill feel more earned than the numbers suggest. Both sides have a point. The Lich King lives in this weird space where legend and reality don't quite match. And honestly, that's more interesting than if he was just another damage check. But if the Lich King proved that narrative can make a fight feel harder than it is, the next boss proved that pure mechanical brutality never goes out of style. Ragnaros, Firelands. You already knew this guy. Everyone did. Ragnaros was the first real raid boss most vanilla players ever fought, the giant firelord screaming too soon before melting half your raid. So when Blizzard brought him back in Cataclysm's Firelands patch in June 2011, players were thrilled. Finally, a rematch with the original legend, but Blizzard didn't just bring him back, they cranked him to 11. Heroic Ragnaros sat at roughly 13 million HP with a brutal 9-minute enrage timer, and that combination created something WoW hadn't really seen before. This wasn't a fight where knowing the mechanics was enough. You could understand every phase perfectly, dodge every ability flawlessly, and still lose because your DPS wasn't high enough, period. If your guild didn't have optimal rotations, the right compositions, and enough gear, you were mathematically locked out of the kill. The timer didn't care how good your strategy was. That's a fundamentally different kind of hard. Most bosses punish you for making mistakes. Ragnaros punished you for not being fast enough. Your rotation had to be perfect, not good, perfect. Every global cooldown mattered. Every potion timed exactly right. Guilds reported anywhere from 50 to 120 attempts just to get their first heroic kill, with some spending over 200 hours before they could farm him consistently. And here's the thing, a lot of casual guilds, they never killed him. The gear requirements alone created a wall that no amount of practice could climb over, but nobody really hated him for it. That's the weird part, because it was Ragnaros. Players loved fighting this guy again. The nostalgia softened the frustration in a way that a brand new boss never could have. Some call it perfectly tuned difficulty. Others call it overtuned repetition disguised by rose-tinted glasses. Both sides have a point, but if Ragnaros tested whether your guild could play fast enough, the next boss tested whether your guild could survive long enough. And that difference matters more than you think. Lei I Shen, Throne of Thunder. Lei Shen didn't just kill players, he killed guilds. Entire communities that had raided together for years walked into Throne of Thunder and never walked out. And that's not an exaggeration. Here's the thing about Lei Shen. On paper, he looks manageable. A multi-phase structure built around 4 conduits, 3 main combat phases separated by 2 transition phases, and a design that rewards coordination. Standard stuff for a final boss. But the execution required was something else entirely. The fight revolved around those 4 conduits, each one granting Lei Shen different abilities depending on which ones were active. Every transition phase forced your raid to split up and handle mechanics simultaneously across the platform. You needed cooldown stacking timed down to the second. You needed every single player hitting their marks with 0 margin for error. One person drifts out of position during a transition, wipe. One healer blows a cooldown 2 seconds early, wipe. Guilds reported 100 to 200 plus attempts during world progression, and most of those attempts ended in the exact same way, instantly. But here's where it gets dark. The difficulty spike from the previous tier wasn't just steep, it was a cliff. Guilds that had been comfortably clearing earlier Mists of Pandaria content suddenly hit an impossible wall. Teams that thought they were progressing fine realized overnight that they simply weren't good enough, and for many of them, that realization was permanent. Lei Shen is directly responsible for multiple documented guild disbands during missed progression. Not roster shuffles, not temporary breaks, full disbands, years of friendships, raid schedules, and shared history, gone because one boss broke them. This is the moment Blizzard broke the power curve mid-expansion, a massive increase in effective difficulty from the prior tier. The community erupted over whether that kind of spike was fair raid design or cruel overtuning. And honestly, nobody ever settled that debate. Some called it the best fight in Mists, others called it the reason they quit raiding entirely. Both sides had a point, but at least Lei Shen only ended guilds during progression. The next boss on our list ended an entire faction's identity. Garrosh Hellscream. This fight has been robbed and nobody wants to admit it. When people talk about the hardest bosses in Mists of Pandaria, Lei Shen dominates the conversation. And look, Lei Shen was brutal. We literally just covered him. But Garrosh Hellscream on 25 player heroic was arguably harder, and the reason he doesn't get that recognition has nothing to do with the actual fight. It has everything to do with timing. Here's what happened. Lei Shen broke guilds. We established that. He dissolved rosters, ended raid teams, and burned through months of progression. By the time Siege of Orgrimmar launched in September 2013, the guilds that actually made it to Garrosh were already running on fumes. Depleted rosters, exhausted leadership, burned out raiders. Some guilds never even reached him because Lei Shen had already killed them. Not Garrosh, like Lei Shen. And that's exactly why Lei Shen gets all the credit. He was the wall people remember hitting. Garrosh was the wall behind the wall that only the survivors got to experience. But the survivors will tell you something interesting. Garrosh was worse. The numbers alone are staggering. Approximately 380 million HP on 25 player heroic with an 11-minute, 15-second enrage timer. Guilds reported anywhere from 150 to over 400 attempts. Some logged 300 to 500 hours of progression rating on this single encounter. That's not a boss fight, that's a part-time job. And then there's phase 4, empowered whirling corruption. Some players call it the single hardest individual phase in WoW history, and they might be right. The execution window was razor thin. You had almost 0 room for error, and a single player messing up didn't just hurt the raid, it cascaded. One failure triggered a chain reaction that guaranteed a full wipe. Every attempt that reached Phase 4 felt like defusing a bomb where 25 people all had to cut the right wire at the exact same time. But because the guilds that experienced this were already a smaller, more exhausted pool, fewer voices existed to talk about it. Lei Shen's reputation grew louder while Garrosh quietly demolished the teams tough enough to reach him. It's one of WoW's biggest reputation gaps, and if you think that's an unfair legacy, wait until you see what Archimonde did to the guilds that thought Warlords of Draenor would be easier. Archimonde, Hellfire Citadel. Archimonde didn't just end Warlords of Draenor. He ended the idea that mythic raiding was something every dedicated guild could eventually achieve. Here's the thing. Every expansion final boss before this had a difficulty curve. You progressed through normal, then heroic, and mythic was the next logical step. Harder, sure, but the same fight scaled up. Archimonde threw that entire philosophy in the trash. The mythic version of this fight included mechanics that literally did not exist on heroic, not harder versions of existing mechanics, completely new ones, mechanics you had never seen, never practiced, never even knew were coming. And the numbers backed up the brutality. Approximately 650 million HP on 20-player mythic with a 12-minute enrage timer. Guilds reported anywhere from 200 to over 400 attempts just to get the kill. World First Contention demanded 400 to 600 plus hours of progression. That's not a boss fight, that's a part-time job. But the mechanics aren't what made Archimonde infamous. The controversy is the heroic to mythic difficulty cliff was so extreme that a massive portion of the raiding community simply stopped. Not "we'll get it next week" stopped, "we are never killing this boss" stopped. Entire guilds looked at Mythic Archimonde, looked at what it demanded, and collectively decided it wasn't worth the attempt. That had never happened at this scale before. Mythic raiding went from aspirational to genuinely exclusive overnight. And the community response completely fractured. Zero middle ground. Players who killed Mythic Archimonde will tell you the difficulty was appropriate, that it rewarded the best players, that this is what endgame rating should be. Players who didn't kill him use one phrase over and over, badly tuned, nobody changed anyone's mind, nobody compromised. The divide became permanent. This was the moment Blizzard, intentionally or not, turned mythic raiding into an elite club, and the player base has never fully agreed on whether that was brilliant design or a catastrophic mistake. But if Archimonde fractured the community over difficulty philosophy, the next boss on this list pushed mechanical complexity to a place that earned almost universal respect. Gul'dan, the Nighthold. Almost every boss on this list comes with an asterisk. Some players think the fight was overtuned, others say it was a gear check disguised as a mechanic check. There's always debate, always controversy. But Gul'dan gets something almost no WoW boss ever receives, universal respect, and he earned every bit of it. Released in January 2017 during Legion, Mythic Gul'dan sat at approximately 1.2 billion HP with a 12-minute 30-second enrage timer. The world first kill came from Exorcist just 11 days after Mythic difficulty opened, clocking in at around 248 attempts. That might sound fast on paper, but those 11 days were some of the most grueling, sleep-deprived progression hours the world first scene had seen in years, and for guilds outside that top tier, the fight consumed weeks of progression and hundreds of additional pulls. But the pull count isn't what makes Gul'dan legendary, it's Phase 3. Phase 3 of Mythic Gul'dan demanded simultaneous execution of over 15 unique mechanics happening at the same time, not sequentially, not in waves, all at once. You had to manage every single one of them while maintaining DPS, staying alive, and not clipping a single ability into another player. The mechanic density in that phase is arguably higher than any other encounter in WoW history. Every raider had to be playing at their absolute ceiling, because one person dropping the ball meant a wipe at 8 minutes into a 12-minute fight. Here's the thing, this wasn't a gear check. You couldn't outscale Phase 3, you couldn't brute force it with better items or optimized compositions. You had to be mechanically perfect, period. That's what separated separates Gul'dan from so many other bosses on this list, and the difficulty felt designed, not imposed. It rewarded skill, not patience, and this matters because of context. Legion came directly after Warlords of Draenor, where Mythic Archimonde left a sour taste in the community's mouth over tuning controversies. Gul'dan proved that Blizzard could make a fight brutally hard without it feeling unfair. Players across the entire skill spectrum, from world-first raiders to heroic-only guilds watching kill videos, agreed the fight was just right. That almost never happens. But if you think Gul'dan was the peak of Legion's difficulty, you haven't met his master yet. Kil'jaeden, Tomb of Sargeras. Here's something that has never happened before or since in World of Warcraft. Kil'jaeden is the only villain in the game's history to serve as the final boss of two completely separate expansion tier raids. He anchored Sunwell Plateau back in Burning Crusade, and then Blizzard brought him back a decade later to close out the Tomb of Sargeras in Legion. No other character has bookended two entirely different eras of WoW difficulty design. And the difference between those two fights tells you everything about how far raiding has come. In Sunwell, Kil'jaeden had roughly 9.6 million HP. In Tomb of Sargeras, 1.8 billion on Mythic. That's not a typo. The same character, the same Demon Lord, and his health pool jumped by a factor of nearly 200. The fight around him changed just as dramatically. This wasn't a nostalgia callback. This was a completely rebuilt encounter designed from the ground up to be the true final exam of Legion, and Blizzard was explicit about it. Kil'jaeden Mythic was designed to be harder than Gul'dan. If Nighthold was the midterm, Tomb of Sargeras was the graduation test, and most guilds failed it. World progression took 2 to 3 weeks, with top guilds reporting anywhere from 300 to 600 or more attempts just to get the first kill. The estimated hours for farm consistency ranged from 600 to over 1,000. That's not a boss. That's a part-time job. Phase 2 was the breaking point. Guilds had to simultaneously manage 8 or more portals while dealing with constantly spawning ads, all while maintaining DPS on a boss with a hard 12-minute enrage timer. One portal mishandled and the entire raid collapsed. The coordination required wasn't just high, it was suffocating. Every player had to execute their role perfectly for 12 straight minutes with zero margin for error. But here's what makes Kil'jaeden stand out in this list. The community largely agrees the fight was fair. The DPS checks were demanding but not impossible. The mechanics were complex but not random. Players walked away from progression feeling like they'd been tested, not cheated. Alongside Gul'dan, Kil'jaeden represents Legion's high point in difficulty design, a period where Blizzard consistently delivered encounters that were brutally hard but genuinely respected the players attempting them. Kil'jaeden earned his spot as a 2-time final boss, but if you think a well-designed Demon Lord is scary, wait until you hear about a boss so underrated that most players forgot it even existed. Unat, Harbinger of the Void. Nobody talks about this boss, and that's exactly the problem. Unat, Harbinger of the Void dropped in April 2019 during Battle for Azeroth's patch 8.1.5, and it might be the single most underrated difficult encounter in World of Warcraft history. Not because it was secretly easy, not because guilds breezed through it, but because it had the misfortune of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here's the thing. The Crucible of Storms was only 2 bosses total. That's a tiny raid tier by WoW standards, and when your entire raid is that short, the final boss carries a disproportionate amount of weight. Unat was that weight. Approximately 1.65 billion HP on 25 player Mythic, a 10-minute 45-second enrage timer, and 3 distinct phases that each introduced their own mechanics. This wasn't a pushover. The world first guild pieces needed 731 attempts to bring this thing down. That's real difficulty. That's the kind of number that puts you in the conversation with expansion ending bosses. But Unat never got that conversation. World progression itself only took about 1 to 2 weeks, which sounds fast until you remember the raid was 2 bosses deep. the density of difficulty per boss was enormous. You weren't spending weeks on trash tiers to get there, you were hitting a wall almost immediately. So, the real tragedy is positioning. Aonat doesn't have the narrative weight of a Sylvanas or the infamy of a Garrosh. It wasn't the climax of an expansion. It wasn't the villain everyone had been waiting to fight. It was a mid-expansion, void horror, tucked inside a mini-raid that most players forgot existed 6 months later, and because of that, it gets left off every hardest bosses list, despite genuinely belonging on them. 3 phases, over 700 wipes for the world first, a brutally tight enraged timer, and almost zero cultural recognition. If any boss on this list deserves flowers it never received, it's Unat. Quietly, legitimately difficult, and almost completely forgotten. But if you think being forgotten is rough, imagine being one of the most famous characters in Warcraft history and having your boss fight become one of the most controversial encounters ever designed. Sylvanas Windrunner. This fight should have been legendary. Sylvanas Windrunner, one of the most iconic characters in Warcraft history, finally standing as a raid boss in Sanctum of Domination. Patch 9.1, July 2021. The moment Shadowlands had been building toward. And the fight is fine, that's the problem. It's fine on paper. The numbers look respectable. Approximately 2.1 billion HP on Mythic with a 12-minute, 30-second enrage timer. Guilds reported anywhere from 200 to 500 plus attempts during progression. Phase 3 introduced a Banshee form mechanic that split the raid and forced coordinated movement across platforms. These are legitimate challenges. Nobody's saying the fight was free, but here's where the disappointment creeps in. Compare Sylvanas to what came before her. Gul'dan had 15 plus mechanics firing simultaneously. Kil'jaeden in Tomb of Sargeras was a genuine nightmare of portal management and overlapping phases. Those fights demanded mechanical mastery at every level. Sylvanas demanded that you hit the boss hard enough and don't stand in the bad stuff. The split raid movement in Phase 3 was the only mechanic that genuinely tested coordination, and even that was more about execution than problem solving. This wasn't an accident. Sylvanas represents a documented shift in Blizzard's design philosophy during Shadowlands. Less mechanical complexity, more throughput pressure. The primary difficulty lever wasn't can your raid handle 12 things at once. It was can your DPS meet the check. And for a lot of players, that felt like a downgrade. The real tension is between who Sylvanas was in the story and what she was as a boss. This was a character who burned Teldrassil, shattered the Helm of Domination, and dragged the entire plot of Shadowlands behind her. Players spent months waiting to finally take her down. The narrative weight of that kill was enormous, and the fight just didn't match the moment. It felt proportionally underwhelming, like the climax of a movie that forgot to write a third act. Mechanically simpler, narratively massive. That gap between expectation and execution defines the Sylvanas encounter more than any single mechanic ever could. And it's a case study in something important. Difficulty isn't just about numbers, it's about whether the fight feels worthy of the story it's telling. But if Sylvanas felt like a step back, the next boss on this list proves Blizzard wasn't done experimenting with what hard actually means. Tindral Sage Swift. After 17 years of guild-breaking bosses, mathematically impossible encounters, and emergency hotfixes, we end here. Tindral Sage Swift, Seer of the Flame, released in November 2023 during Dragonflight's patch 10.2. And honestly, he's not the hardest boss on this list. Not even close, but that's exactly why he's the perfect one to end on. Tindral sits at approximately 2.8 billion HP on 25 player Mythic with an 11-minute 45-second enrage timer. Guilds reported 150 to 350 attempts for their first kills, with an estimated 300 to 500 hours invested before consistent farm clears became realistic. World progression took about 1 to 2 weeks. tweaks. The fight introduced dragon-themed mechanics, including Inferno Leap and Fearlath buff management, demanding coordination and awareness across the entire raid. Here's the thing. Those numbers are significant. They represent real difficulty, real-time investment, real skill requirements, but compare them to what we've covered today. See, Thune was literally unbeatable. Yogg-Saron Zero Light was killed by 2 guilds on the entire planet. Mythic Kil'jaeden in Tomb of Sargeras demanded 600 to 1,000 hours of progression. Tindral is hard, but it's hard in a way that feels intentional rather than punishing, and that's not an accident. That's a philosophy. Blizzard designed Tindral to challenge without crushing. The mechanics are layered and interesting. The DPS checks are tight but achievable. A single mistake doesn't instantly delete your raid the way Four Horsemen or Muru used to. You wipe, you learn, you adjust, you kill it. The fight respects your time while still demanding excellence. But here's where the real debate starts. Is that better? Sunlara, look at the full arc we've covered today. We started with Sathun in 2006, a boss so overtuned that the best players in the world couldn't physically kill it until Blizzard intervened. We end with Tindral in 2023, a boss carefully calibrated to sit in the sweet spot between accessible and demanding. That's 17 years of Blizzard learning what hard should actually mean. 17 years of guild disbands, emergency nerfs, community outrage, and slow, painful iteration. Yeah, the old philosophy said difficulty meant destruction. If guilds weren't breaking apart, the boss wasn't hard enough. Sathun embodied that, Muru embodied that, Mythic Archimand embodied that, and those encounters created legendary moments that players still talk about decades later. The new philosophy says difficulty should feel fair, challenging, demanding, punishing of mistakes, but never mathematically impossible, never designed to make you quit. Tindral embodies that, and the guilds that killed him walked away feeling accomplished rather than traumatized. So which is better? Brutal authenticity or balance challenge? The raw, unforgiving chaos of early WoW where anything could happen, and most of what happened was failure? Or the carefully tuned modern design where difficulty is a dial Blizzard controls with precision? Nobody has the answer. Blizzard certainly doesn't. The community has been arguing about it since 2006, and they'll be arguing about it long after the servers eventually go dark. Maybe that tension, that impossible balance between too hard and not hard enough, is the thing that's kept WoW rating alive for nearly 2 decades. Every boss on this list broke something. Guilds, expectations, the game itself. And every single one of them made World of Warcraft's rating scene what it is today. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.